really want to introduce Eric Nazarian, who is a filmmaker, a screenwriter, a very passionate humanist who manages to find the humanity in every story that he watches or that he writes. And what he's going to do today is tell us about the transition through cinema, through these 25 years of post-Soviet cinema in Armenia. Eric, we're very happy that you're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salpijan, and the whole gang at Institute of Armenian Studies that I'm a proud fellow of, as this is my alma mater. So I'm going to speak somewhat fast because we're going to have to fit a cow into a filet mignon in about 15 minutes. Is this working, Susie John? Okay, coolio. All right. So the subject I chose to do today is basically pioneers and touchstones, to give you kind of a brief Reader's Digest overview of the history of Soviet and post-Soviet Armenian cinema. I think it's important to understand the context. If we're going to try and understand the context of what's happened in these last 25 years of transition, it's also important to understand the past as prologue and how we kind of reached the place that we are today in Armenian cinema. What is the Armenian cinema industry? So basically, this image I picked because this was probably one of the first, if ever, images of Armenians depicted in film, and it's by a film by Alexander Minervin made in pre-revolutionary Russia called The Tragedy of Turkish Armenia, or Under the Yoke of the Kurds. I'm sorry, the fonts seem to be off because there was a different fonting, so it wasn't meant to be this way. Apologies in the transfer of that. But the first time the world was introduced to Armenians in the teens, it was of a starving, victimized, destroyed people. Notably 1919, with the success of Ravished Armenia, the film industry in America and in Australia, in England, parts of Europe, were introduced to these massacres. So this was a very unfortunate but understandable kind of crossings of the parallels of history and motion picture technology, because Armenians were mass exported to the world as victims, as massacre survivors, deportation survivors. Obviously, the term genocide was not invented at the time. But come 1920, after the insane years of the teens in post-genocide with the wars and with the Sovietization of Armenia, the central film industry was created under the guise of the Soviet Socialist Republic. And what that did was ultimately gave birth to the Soviet Armenian cinema that was largely founded by none other than Hamobek Nazarian, who was the D.W. Griffith of Armenian cinema. Born in Yerevan, raised in Tbilisi, Russia. He was an actor in Russian films, and he had a real passion for storytelling, literature, theater. And the first Armenian silent film that was made, called Namus, Honor, was based on a play by Alexander Shirvanzadeh, who was born in the Shirvan province in Azerbaijan, who had basically seen the underbelly of the oil factories and had become somewhat of a feminist, and wrote this play that dealt with basically the subjugation of women and this doomed masculinity of the patriarchies. So this film really was a Georgian-Armenian co-production under the curtain, obviously under the umbrella of the budding Soviet film industry. And it dealt with populist themes. It was a very good blockbuster. It traveled very well all across the Soviet Union. And that's Racha Nersesyan, who's kind of like the Khashlama Rudolph Valentino, who was a very famous actor. The following year, he follows up with Zare, which is the first Kurdish film in the history of cinema set in a Yazidi village in Armenia. And what's fascinating about this film is, again, themes of Romeo and Juliet, the themes of national identity, ethnic identity. By 1935, Bek Nazarian makes the first sound film. The music is composed by none other than Aram Khachaturian. And again, at this time, you had some incredible innovations, because Ruben Mamoulian had traveled from Tiflis to Hollywood, where he made in the 20s Applause, which was, again, one of the first films that experimented with the new creation of sound in motion pictures. During this process, obviously, it's Soviet Armenia. You have an incredible sense of the proletariat as well as Big Brother watching you. I wanted to include, I love Soviet posters, propaganda posters, so I had to throw these two in. One is keep your tongue behind your teeth, which is obviously very emblematic of what the Soviet Union propagated. And this is my favorite. And they call us pigs. And it was an anti-alcoholism propaganda poster, which ultimately leads to Sergei Parajanov, who was unfortunately persecuted and very brave in creating some of the most important, probably the best film d'auteur of the Soviet Union, along with Andrei Tarkovsky of its day. He made Shadows of Our Forgotten Ancestors in the Ukraine, as well as Color of Pomegranates in Armenia, about Sayat-Nova. So between Beknazarov, Parajanov, and this budding industry, you saw a lot of hopscotching between the Soviet republics. There was a lot of integration. There was a lot of cross-cultural co-production, let's say, between film artists and between the film sector and co-productions, which is what makes it fascinating how rich and colorful and resplendent the Armenian cinema was during the Soviet times, which was the golden age of Armenian cinema. And then you have Artavas Pelesyan, the documentary, non-narrative filmmaker that made some incredible meditations on Armenians that are non-narrative. I highly recommend you watch these. They're available on YouTube. Then you have Fronzik Duvlatyan, the legendary filmmaker who made Hello, It's Me, that was the Palme d'Or nominee at the Cannes Film Festival in '66. These scripts were incredibly well prepared. The art of screenwriting was equally important as filmmaking. And during this golden age, you had these incredible writers that came out. Nahapet, Henrik Malyan, that was nominated for the Certain Regard in Cannes. Tango of Our Childhood, Albert Mukherjee, who's the brother of Fronzik Mukherjee, Venice Film Festival. So during the Soviet times, these films really traveled well, not just within the Soviet Union, but in Europe and around the world. Armenian cinema had a flag in the sand. And they were dealing with extremely Armenian stories, but the sensibility of the film narrative they were able to export and make it more interesting and more relevant to non-Armenian audiences, which is what good films should do. Then in the 80s, slowly but surely, the dark clouds started to gather. Even the film posters somewhat have a more Kafkaesque, more psychological realism to it. Nerses Hovhannisyan's Strange Games, also The 13th Apostle by Suren Babayan, based on a Ray Bradbury story. So the big transition here comes in the late 80s with the Gyumri earthquake and the perestroika glasnotes and the call for independence and breaking away from the Soviet Union. This is, one of the tragic end or violent beginning. Arguably you can argue both ways, but between Gyumri and the pogroms in Kirovabad, in Sumgait, and in Baku, Armenian filmmakers at the time, started to question, what the validity of the industry was anymore. The centralized film industry that was state subsidized and supported gradually started to crack and wither and start to die along with the Soviet Union. Some of the last films, like Garod Frunze Dovlatyan's in 1990, again, goes back to Stalinist themes of the Armenian notion of yearning, and of Arakel, who crosses the Arax River, goes back to Turkey, and is arrested and convicted of being a spy and sent to Siberia. So these films and these filmmakers still had a very haunting for the past, and they dealt with these themes as much as they could, the veteran ones that were allowed to make these films. And obviously with the war and independence from 1991 onwards with Nagorno-Karabakh, the entire, the box exploded, and Armenian filmmakers ultimately were left without a home. High film went into rapid decline. There was hardly any films being produced. There was no money. There was, the double whammy of a massive earthquake as well as an ongoing war up until the ceasefire in 1994. So come around 1991 with the independence, these younger filmmakers and established 80s filmmakers like Harutun Khachaturian and Mikhail Vartanov and Vigen Chaldranyan and these guys that were working in the 80s basically became captains without a ship, and they didn't have the subsidy system that was so desperately required to continue to produce films in a consistent basis. Some of them spent years trying to find funding for their films. Others basically became teachers, and then eventually throughout, and I kind of compressed this because of our limitations on time, but I always think of Janis Joplin when I think of this notion of freedom, and me and Bobby McGee. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. A lot of the losses that were incurred during this period, the one positive aspect of this incredible depression of the 90s and early 2000s was that censorship disappeared along with the USSR. State funding and the film industry infrastructure was in rapid decline. But what's interesting is, come the end of the 90s, the democratization of technology from film to digital really cut costs for film production by leaps and bounds. So hence you had the generation of Dogma, you had a whole new generation of documentary filmmakers, of student filmmakers that were able to actually start experimenting with film grammar. Film was no longer relegated to the prehistoric notion of celluloid. And I'm a film guy. I would shoot every single film if I could on film. I still think it's way superior than digital. Somebody will shoot me next door. But what that did was basically these independent filmmakers were able to keep working within the confines of their limitations, and many, many themes arose. The tradition of Armenian storytelling, of narrative, of cinema narrative, of screenwriting, which is different from literary writing, also in an odd way start to go into decline, because these films started to become more meditations on identity, and they were more open-ended. They lacked a narrative thread. They became very Armeno-centric for the most part. So these films traveled very well within Armenia, within the film art house circles, but somehow they were having a more difficult time being released or appreciated, like the films that I showed you beforehand, Nahapet, Hello, It's Me, Tango of Our Childhood. And ultimately, you had the Soviet Armenian tradition of folklore literary adaptations. And then come 2003, the Golden Apricot International Film Festival is created, which is a beautiful beacon and one of the greatest creations in the Republic of Armenia, because it's created a vehicle for these young filmmakers to showcase. I myself have been blessed by their graciousness in being able to screen my films there and teach courses there for the directors across border, and it's basically become the Khan of the Caucasus. So from my experience, Armenia doesn't really have a film industry. It has a film culture. It is not a film industry that could be competitive, where you can, and I've tried this several times, to bring productions to Armenia, including my current production, Sandcastle Girls, that I'll be shooting in the Middle East. But the problem is, understandably, given the decline of the state infrastructure and the National Cinema Center's limited resources based on the budgetary limitations every year that's allocated, we do not really have a film industry that could sustain itself. In the last 10, 15 years, there's been many treaties signed with the World Trade Organization, the CNC in France, the Centre National du Cinémathèque, the European co-production workshops. It's slowly but surely becoming, they just signed the Eurimage's co-production treaty, so they're trying to create minority co-productions in Armenia. I don't want to get into the technical side of it as much. I'm more than happy to provide you with more details about it. But basically, drawing this kind of 25-year transition, to a close, I think the key themes that we haven't been able to address in Armenia is, how do we sustain a film industry where we have republics like Romania or Malaysia, developing countries that have been able to really revolutionize and really centralize their film industry and export their culture this way, as well as monetize these films that are made for under $1 million. They sell them to 100 and 120 territories, at the same time exporting their culture. Same thing with Iran, same thing with Turkey. Armenia, unfortunately, is still 25 years behind the times. There's no centralized understanding of how the money works, other than who knows who and who's involved with what. And now, slowly but surely, they're creating these co-productions that are very beneficial, but unfortunately, we've kind of lost that grand epic scale of Armenian storytelling. And the tragedy is also, we've kind of lost our wit and our humor. A lot of the films during the Soviet times had remarkable wit and humor that transcended the language and was able to be exported. So even the lack of humor and wit in our filmmaking, in our film stories, has to do with the reality of the times we are living in, because the current filmmaking generation that I experience on the ground with my colleagues and friends, everybody is in some sort or another of an existential or a quarter-life crisis, not knowing how they're going to make these films, who's going to subsidize them. So they go off and make these very, very tiny micro-budget movies that ultimately end up being played in small art house festivals. But there's no real product for us to export, unlike the Soviet era. I'm sorry if this is a downer, but these are some of the films that I kind of personally picked from the early 90s because it was a critical transitional period. The Damned was a film I saw in high school. It was the first film where they showed an Armenian prison, and they showed an intellectual, elderly professor getting raped by these thugs, who arguably are the same thugs that you see in Yerevan these days. And it deals with themes of freedom and identity and, wanting to stand up and be independent. And it also, the film ends with Pink Floyd's Welcome to the Machine, which I'm sure they did not get the rights to. My friend Harutu Khachaturyan's Return to the Promised Land, again, the aftermath of the Armenian-Azerbaijani War, the aftermath of what a working class family does when they return to the land that's promised them. What are the themes of homeland, of identity. Vigen Chaldranian's A Voice in the Wilderness, based on the remarkable novel by Agassi Ayvazyan, again dealing with an Armenian monk's spiritual calling and the trials and tribulations that he experiences in the Middle Ages. Where Were You, Man of God is interesting because it could very well be the first mini-series that was right there on the tail end. It's a 5.5 hour epic film that deals with Stalinism and Sos Sarkisian and just a whole kind of sweeping kind of history. It's almost like one of those big Thomas Wolfe books dealing with an Armenian family across these 5 epochs. And it's really, very commendable that given the fact that the society was crumbling, this man was able to complete this film. Arnold Aghababyan, formerly Aghababov. And then we have Enker Panchuni, which is by Armen Manaryan, one of the, again, last Western Armenian literary adaptations by Yervant Odyan. The previous one that I love very much is Tăjvijik by Aterbet, that was made in the 60s. So in the early 90s, they were still able to keep their heads high above water just to be able to finish these. And Forest Hospital is interesting because it's a film about a hospital in Nagorno-Karabakh during the height of the war. These are, 5 or 6 films that give you a quilt of Armenian cinema during the crux of the transition period. And obviously I can go into much, much more detail. But basically, we discussed the democratization of technology. The Mary Bus by Albert Mukherjee, who's a Gyumretsi, another great film set right after the Gyumri earthquake. Story of People in War and Peace, excellent documentary that Vartan Ovanesyan made while he was in Qarabagh about these men that he was in the trenches with, and then 20 years later after he finds them, 15 years I think. And the whole history of that generation that went to war and came back and basically became exiles in their own homeland. And then let me see, which one is that? Dawn on a Sad Street, that was made in 2008 with Albert Mukherjee. Again, that's set in the Gyumri of the 90s post-earthquake. Love and Gratitude, a beautiful little short film set in a wine family in Armenia. And then The Last Tightrope Dancer of Armenia, beautiful story by our friends Arman Yeritzian, about the dying, the last of the Mohicans of the Armenian tightrope walkers, and these 2 men and these 2 sons that they have adopted, and the whole kind of dying of this tradition. It's really remarkably done, and that film was very well shot on digital. Border, Harutu Khachaturyan, deals with the buffalo, and it's in the middle of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. Very, very much non-dialogue, image-driven, very experimental, not narrative really. But ultimately, I like to end on this image because it's one of those iconic images of my childhood that I grew up with in LA. Anytime we were able to watch, a VHS copy of Yerankuni or Nahapet or Ashnan Arev, it harkens back to the past, and David's sword is pointing backwards while we're going forwards. So I think we have a lot of work to do to at least reinvent this film industry. Unfortunately, it's very balkanized, it's very confused, but films are being made in Armenia. Are they reaching their intended audiences? I would argue no. Are they able to reclaim the glory they once had? Absolutely, because we do not have a deficit of themes that we could be making movies about. But we do need a surplus of production means, investments, and real meaningful co-production to be able to create a sustainable film industry. Thank you very much. I'm 1 minute over.
We wanted the filet medium well. We got it medium well. We have 5 minutes for questions.
Sorry I spoke too fast. It's all my fault.
Greg, here comes the microphone. 1 second.
This is more of a historical question, but during the period of Stalinism when he emphasized socialist realism, did the Armenian filmmakers try to press the boundaries on that? Or what is your sense of how that went? Thanks.
Soviet cinema is one of the most important cinemas of the world, of the inception of the motion picture industry worldwide in the teens. You know, Vsevolod Pudovkin, Eisenstein, Dovzhenko. From Stalin to the death of Stalin, from Stalin's rising to the death of Stalin, there were the worst films in the history of mankind were made in the Soviet Union. Right when Stalin dies is when the thaw, Khrushchev's era, when you have the 1960s films like I Am Cuba, The Cranes Are Flying, Grigory Chukray's Ballad of a Soldier. So these films are the ones that Andrei Tarkovsky, Parajanov were all products of the post-Stalinist era. To my knowledge, no. I mean, they were making films like Zangezur, about the Dashnak uprisings in Syunik that Hamobek Nazarian made, that Aram Khachaturian scored again. They were making much more safer productions, none that I could point to with absolute confidence and say a work of cinematic genius like the films that we paid attention to. But there was a death of Soviet cinema from the time Stalin came to life. And he's the one that killed Eisenstein because he kept recutting Ivan the Terrible and Alexander Nevsky. They wanted all these mythopoetic propaganda pieces to re-galvanize the Russian, proletariat, the Soviet proletariat, to basically become these Ubermenches within their own rights.
Other questions? I have one.
Yes.
I remember with independence, everybody assumed that the writers would have, drawerfuls of things they couldn't publish but that they'd written. And it didn't happen. And then we waited a few more years and a trickle, but not really that much. Is there a parallel in the film world that you would think that there would be this explosion of something and there isn't? Or is it a matter of resource?
I think it's somewhat 50-50. I think the problem is that there's no centralized film school or involvement from the outside world, because we've had 25 years of balkanization within our own society. We have 25 years of this young generation coming up, dealing with issues of identity, of survival. But the mastery of narrative, of film narrative, the way it was taught by the Russian masters, because the Russians schooled us in cinema. If you look at these films by Arben Manaryan and Dovlatian, all these men were trained in Russia. They were trained by the masters of Russian cinema. We're lacking mentorship in Armenia. This is a big problem, and it goes back to that, is they have the themes, the identities, the stories, but they don't have the mentorship to be able to really craft screenwriting, which is not storytelling. Screenwriting is a whole other craft. So there's this generation that's lacking that mentorship. And hopefully that's what we're trying to do with Golden Apricot to the best of our capacity. But we still have a long ways to go.
A quick question, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the financing. So first of all, thank you so much for this great presentation. Can you tell a little bit more as to how do you think the industry will evolve? Is there an appetite within the business community, which might include the oligarchs, in investing some of these projects, or even joint projects maybe with Georgia? Is there are there financing prospects there?
Yeah.
So where would the funding come from moving forward?
Initially, the funding would come from the Ministry of Culture, that then trickles down to the National Cinema Center, which is the structure that was built during independence. But their budgets are very limited. I think up to like 650,000 euros for the whole year, which means you're dishing out 75,000 to 100, and you're picking 6 to 7 movies, and it's very competitive and it's very nepotistic. It's nepotistic to the point that makes Soviet Union look G-rated. So the reality is they've just signed several treaties. The problem here is not the lack of will. The problem is we're lacking content that's presentable. Georgia is a perfect example. They've been able to. I've just written a film about Joseph Stalin that's going to go into production probably next year, about Stalin's last days. And we couldn't get it made in Spain. We couldn't get it made. My friend Sergei Bodrov is directing, who's my producing partner. And Georgia said, come, we'll do it for this amount of money. So Georgia has the infrastructure, the industry. They're making very good films. They have a very good film school. They are working with Armenia. I made a film about Tumo in September, and one of my crew members came down from Georgia. It was excellent focus puller. But to answer your question, the reality is I don't know specifically how there's going to be these co-productions evolving over time. It depends on also what happens now that these elections are over and what the new mandate is going to be. Everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen. The idea is Armenia needs to be a little bit more open to this and to be able to present its workforce. And if they're going to put money in and they're going to get money from Eurimages, they need to integrate better with the European community or the European signatories. But like with everything in Armenia, we're bifurcated. Our one heart is in Russia and our lungs are in Europe. So there's this very crazy conflict of interest here that's forbidding these treaties from being ratified or taking a much longer time.
Zavin, and then we'll move on.
Sure.
Quick question. So you did say that it is possible for Armenia to regain the glory of the Soviet times, like making films like that. But would you say that the future of the Armenian films to do that would be in making films that, like some of the new Armenian films that are coming out that are very, again, like you said, Armeno-centric, focusing about the Armenian experience and about issues that are relevant to Armenians but not so much other people? Mm-hmm. Do we continue that way, or how do we do that?
Well, again, I think, first of all, Armenians need a lesson in humility. Everybody's Fellini. Everybody, has the best story ever told. I think we need to look at our neighbors. We need to look at Iran. Iran is one of the most targeted nations in the world, but the best weapon it has is its cinema. And look at what happened this year with, The Salesman. Look at what happened 5 years ago. They're making very Iranian films, but when you study these films, they're deeply universal in nature. And they have that balance. Look at Turkey, Nure Bilge Ceylan, Semih Kaplanoglu, all these filmmakers, they're making films about Turkey, but they're exporting it in a way that's cinematic grammar that's international. Look at Romania, look at Asia. We have to study these developing countries and look at the models and the financing that goes into these films, which are 500,000 to 1 million maximum. And they sell those movies at Cannes to 120 territories. So if you want to talk about cultural, exporting, cinema is the best way to do that, not murabba, unfortunately.